CI is a little easier to picture. Now as we transition into CD and try to deploy, the name of the game in the CICD space is try to iterate faster, try to release things faster, try to add customer value faster. So CD is a little bit harder. Would you agree?
I mean, it's extremely. I think the bar between CI and CD is extremely high.
Yeah, for sure. So CD becomes more effective depending on how we design our infrastructure to deploy our app. Today we're going to talk about CI/CD as one of the top trends in DevOps. So I know you've done some projects in the CI space, and like what kind of stuff are you doing now that we're not tied to physical machines anymore at all? Even if they're VMs, like we don't buy a set of hardware anymore. Like we have kind of like this limitless seemingly data center.
Yeah.
Like
well, I think that historically it was like you have a giant build server. And if we're talking about things that require a build, like Android or Java, or things that require time to go through a process whereby there's maybe possibly even automated testing or some testing as part of that, we're looking at how do we change the mindset from we have this fixed amount of compute that we can leverage all the time because we prepaid for it because it's on-prem, it's hardware, versus the ephemeral compute, which means that we can take massive machines for brief amounts of time to do things faster, right? So the key here is like on an equivalent level, if you say, okay, the processing of an on-prem machine has so much capacity and speed, the equivalent in the cloud might have, a similar speed or capacity. The difference is when things start to scale. So the projects that I'm working on require ability to keep up with a dynamically growing set of requirements that require more and more developers to come into play and build these kind of rather large artifacts and do that in a way that they can do it anytime on demand. And so we spin up giant build servers that last for minutes instead of like an hour or 2 hours of continuous running to build these artifacts and then disappear. And I think part of the CI/CD methodology that we use that works the best is to make sure that we take everything that doesn't require consistent and constant compute, like you're talking about, and make those into larger ephemeral machines so that we can leverage the speed to change without necessarily paying for something that's lying there idle most of the time or even some of the time.
Oh, gotcha. So we maybe we have a pipeline that fires off a build, right? Instead of having numerous people using the same build server,
yes,
a pipeline points to a specific build server. You're saying like make a bunch of copies
or
that?
Yeah, spin up a new one, let it do its thing and then die, and everyone has their own. So if you have 500 developers and they're all trying to use 1 or 2 or 3 on-prem boxes, like it gets inefficient really fast. There's no ability to scale that really easily.
Yeah, and I know you're able to size the VMs then a little different than if you were, say, running VMware on-prem.
Yeah, for sure, right.
Like we might allocate a bunch more vCPUs and try to accelerate that build process.
Yeah, well, we have almost, I don't say infinite, but a great deal more overhead, in terms of what we can size them at versus what we have on-prem, which is contained by the machine that the VM is running on.
Yeah. So this is like really cool for long-running builds, right? Or what were long-running builds at least, if something took a couple hours.
Yeah, or compute heavy, anything that requires a lot of processing. Like image and video processing is a good example. Like doing that on a single machine takes forever, as all production people know who do video, 4K, 8K video. But if you put them off to ephemeral machines and let them do it asynchronously, they can make builds and start doing processing outside of your work environment or your work time, right?
Yeah.
Which makes it much more efficient for people, I think.
Yeah, for sure. In per second billing, does that matter in this space? It sounds like it'd be an advantage.
I think it's huge because if we look at like the on-prem world, we have to forecast when we do our releases for hardware in advance what we think demand will be. So like HVAC, for instance, you have to kind of plan for worst case scenario. And how do you do that in an environment where market demand, business demand changes, especially when you look at 3-year leases or multi-year leases, right? In this case, for the per second billing, we're not kind of burdened by the inefficiencies of pre-purchasing a huge amount of things that we may or may not use, or we might saturate all the way, and then we're left in a difficult situation because we don't have enough compute resources.
Yeah.
So we only use what we need at the time, and if we architect the infrastructure as code, application as code model, it's way more efficient.
Yeah, for sure. So even a build that took a few minutes, if we have per second billing, could save a bit of money, right?
For sure.
By paying on the second instead of rounding up to the next minute.
But at any scale, for sure, I think
Yeah.
that's definitely the way to go.
Yeah. And so global development teams can take advantage of this kind of thing too, right?
Well, especially because, depending on which cloud provider you're on, like you can stand up things anywhere in the world in multiple regions. And that cost of having that multi-region deployment of all your builds and your code repositories, then leverage in those areas these build services that come and go. So, the cost might increase a little bit because of the regions that you're in, but then again, the efficiency is so high because you pay per use that you can change or exchange speed of deployment and change for the cost.
Yeah.
In essence. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So CD is a little bit harder. Would you agree?
I mean, it's extremely. I think the bar between CI and CD is extremely high.
Yeah, for sure. So CD becomes more effective depending on how we design our infrastructure to deploy our app.
Yeah, well, I don't think you can do it in any other way, really, because like in the past, think about doing continuous deployment on an on-prem environment. Like, how would you even really go about doing that? Like, you would have to pre-prep a situation that is wildly complicated, And nowadays with infrastructure as code, not so much, because you can actually stand up the infrastructure as well as applications.
Yeah. So our average customer isn't Netflix, right?
No.
Right. So like, how do you? Let's assume we have some CI in place. How do we get started on a continuous deployment? Like, what's the easiest spot to start from?
Oh man, that's a tough one because to get to CD or even to CI and DevOps in general, it's the whole technology, processing people. We have to kind of make it a mindset, an organizational mindset. But let's say we're saying, okay, we're already deploying, now and then, and we're making updates now and then. Now we want to allow the developers to respond as quickly as possible. I think we have to look at, okay, we're not deploying to the same machine. We're not doing the old school way of we replace what's there with this new code and test it, because there are lots of problems with that. There's errors or issues, or multiple people are making changes to the code base and you're not really aware of what other teams are doing, especially multinational teams, etc.
Yeah.
I think the better way is to actually stand up another ephemeral infrastructure, like replica, and deploy to it and do traffic shaping for the network as code piece, where we can say, let's put like 5 or 10% of people into the new code.
Sure.
Let's see if it's working in the wild. Let's see if we can handle the scale. If not, we can roll it back. And if it does work, we can change the split from 90-10 to 100 for the new deploy code and take down the old one.
Oh yeah, cool. So infrastructure as code comes back into play, right? I mean, we already wrote code and to deploy that whole infrastructure. So you could replicate for every release.
Yep.
Ultimately everything.
The whole environment, everything that supports the environment.
Yeah. So I think one thing I've talked to customers about is that it's kind of ongoing. It's like a continuous improvement process.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. So you start with CI. CI's basic CI in place is something that most development shops are already doing. Right, but then add on a little bit of automation at a time, and eventually 10 years from now you might be a Netflix, or maybe the tool sets are more mature right now to make it that a little more achievable than when they started however many years ago that was.
Well, I've seen, I think the trend is that lots of people try to offload the burden of the automation on the tool set side to like a web hosted CI tool.
Oh, sure, like CI as a service kind of tool.
Exactly. So that's kind of been the new thing. Like I know hosted Spinnaker from Google and other things are on the rise now, but I feel like the tool in and of itself is never going to be enough. Like there has to be a core fundamental organizational mindset to be able to support this type of thing. And that's why it does take iteration and time, because the change management of each component piece leading from CI to CD needs to be in play before it actually can happen in a way that's not a disaster.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for watching this episode of CloudUp.
Leave your comments and questions below and win some Agosto sway.
Thanks, and see you next time.